Welcome back to the Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. As you know, the Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire, developing new technologies for putting out fires. Check us out on the web at teamwildfire.com. Speaking of fires and the forests in which they take place, I've got Joe Scott with us today, and Joe is a principal wildfire analyst. He is with Pyrologix. He's actually the founder of Pyrologix, which just recently merged with Vibrant Planet, Allison Wolf's wonderful venture there. And Joe's been working in forestry in one form or another since, well, we'll just call it the mid-'80s, right? Because who cares about the specifics? Joe, welcome to the Fire Break. How are you?
I'm doing great, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining me. So tell me, how did you get into forestry? And in your initial experiences there, what ideas did you pick up along the way?
Yeah, I got my start in forestry and fire by looking at the course catalog at UC Berkeley, where I got in undeclared and come from a family of mostly attorneys and other white collar
Criminals.
endeavors.
I mean,
And
right.
and then yeah, and then but I was just really drawn in the course catalog to the forestry curriculum and not to any of the other stuff. And so I eventually declared forestry as my major. And then as part of the forestry, you have to go to a accredited summer camp.
Okay.
And at the summer camp for the summer, I met Bob Martin, who came to talk about wildfire. And while he was there just for a few days, he mentioned that he was looking for a student to work for him and his grad students, and asked if anybody in the van, there were 7 people there, if any of them wanted a job. And I already had a job, so I hesitated, but my job was delivering pizza for Domino's. So I said, yeah, I'll do it. And really, that's it. That's my start in forestry and in fire, was that serendipity of just saying yes to Bob Martin. And
So
then,
you're saying you gave up the potential for a successful career at Domino's just to work in forestry.
that's right. Yeah, and the law. And so I have a brother and 3 sisters. All 3 of my sisters are attorneys. They went into the family business.
Okay, so they didn't need another attorney in the family.
Not at all.
And so you're hoping that with sufficient amount of forestry work, you could offset the impact of 3 attorneys?
Uh, I can try really hard.
All
They'll,
right.
they'll be tough to beat.
So what did they teach you early on?
So back then, so that's in the late '80s when I was in forestry school, and that was where wildfire lived at universities at the time, was in forestry. And as you can imagine, well, you know of the fire triangle of, I always called it the fuel, oxygen, and heat. And then, of
And
course, we
chemical
have,
reaction, right?
yeah, that's right. And then we have the fire behavior triangle in wildland fire, and that's fuel, weather, and topography. And I put fuel into first in the front of all 3 of those because that's how we were taught. And coming from forestry, wildfire is about fuel, and then weather, and then topography. And I remember taking a class at Cal in a natural disasters class, and the professor there about all different kinds of natural disasters called wildfire a meteorological phenomenon. And I was really upset that didn't jibe with what I was being taught across campus in forestry. It's more of a biometeorological, it's really complicated, but a biological phenomenon, not meteorological. So I kind of dismissed that idea. It's really about fuels first. And then, and even into the 90s, I think, late 90s, Bessie and Johnson up in Canada published a paper talking about the importance of climate on fire currents in northern boreal forests, all of which burned up last year in Canada.
Right.
And they published that paper saying, hey, climate's pretty strong driver up here in this stuff. And that actually prompted a professor of forestry in Washington State to adapt a limerick. You've heard this limerick. Whether the weather is hot or whether the weather is not, we must weather the weather, whatever the weather, whether we like it or not. Well,
I have never heard that.
okay,
And I
we gotta
appreciate
tough it out.
That's great.
Yeah, gotta tough out the weather. Well, he adapted that to say whether the weather's hot, whether the weather's not. Topography and fuels are part of the rules, whether we like it or not. And just really hanging on like I was, to the idea that fuel is the driving everything. And so that just us old guys, people who've been in this field for a long time, I think we're all really pretty strongly anchored on that. And actually, at the time in the late 80s, climate change was just starting to be discussed. And there was an enormous amount of skepticism at that time about everything about it. And so, more or less, this field started with, hey, this is about fuel. And weather has to be there, but that's about it. And then, yeah, just I think over time, I and others, and some others even more than me, have been slow to accept that we should have been calling it weather or climate, fuel, and topography, and acknowledge the strong importance of climate and weather on fire.
So this set you up the thinking that it was all about fuel. And then other people came in with the idea, no, it's about weather, it's about topography. And there was just this huge inclination to resist that because that was later news. And right,
Yeah.
primacy being the main influence of our attitudes.
Yeah.
So how did this set you up for success or failure?
Well, it was just there for a long time, and I used to see as wildfire was increasing, especially in the western U.S. over the decades, I saw it as potentially being a self-correcting problem. That if the problem is fuel, then getting more fire means more fuel modification, and then you'll eventually get less fire. The problem will self-correct. And I think we've been seeing a fair amount of evidence that that actually might not happen at all. One of them being actually is the campfire in 2018, obviously, very well known. What isn't super well known is that where that fire started and for the first few miles of it spread was through an area that had burned just 10 years before, 10 or 11 years before that. And that, until that moment, would have been considered to be impossible, that a fire could do what it did in a 10-year-old burn. And it obviously it did it because of the weather on that day, not and nothing else. Yeah, and so think the fire, and one of the way that I look at this too is that the fire regime is changing over time, and we used to have, like especially in dry forests, in the West, we had a regime of frequent low intensity fires. And that's been transitioning into a regime of less frequent, higher intensity fires in all places. And that's largely a result, not at first of climate at all, but of mostly the influence of fire suppression.
Right. The more you put it out, the more fuels you build up.
That's right. And so that the influence of fire suppression, and my colleague here, I've published with her at the Fire Lab, Dr. Elizabeth Reinhart. She quoted Shakespeare on our fire suppression as that we have suppressed fire not wisely but too well.
Ooh.
And that was in Othello.
Yes, I was actually Shakespeare major. That was
okay.
Yeah. So
I think, and she was an English major. And I think that literally, that just that one line just sums up. We did a very nice job of fire suppression starting, well, I mean, late 1800s where we just started, but it wasn't until 1910,
yeah,
after the big blow up that we got increasingly good at it, and we're not done increasing our capacity. And so that's just that. I think what happened here is that fire suppression, not wisely but too well, did significantly alter fuel across the landscape, mostly in the dry forests and other places that used to burn frequently and now didn't burn as frequently anymore.
I see.
Did set us up. But it's not probably what's driving the fairly recent, like last few decades, general increase in fire occurrence. And for the only thing that convinced me of that was reading about and looking ourselves at the record of fire climate and seeing that actually the fire climate has been changing in lockstep. And the fuelscape really hasn't been. It got worse early on, and it's just been hanging out at not that great in some places.
So we put out all the fires, we built up more fuel, and we continued to believe that more suppression was the answer, which continued to make things worse. And now there we are. And now that we have more fuel on the ground, we also have more heat. Thank goodness we don't have more oxygen, or we'd really be screwed, right?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So it sounds like you've had an epiphany on this, and perhaps, realized, darn it, what they taught me coming into this probably didn't apply well then, and certainly doesn't apply well now. So what do we do now? I guess our option is change the weather.
No. So that's what's interesting. It's the paradox that even if climate is the driver of the recent changes that we're seeing, managing fuel is still the solution, or part of the solution.
Well, just to clarify, it is still the solution, or it should still be the solution?
Well, it should be a part of the solution. So
Okay.
What I'm saying is that even though climate might be driving the increase in occurrence, we can't in any reasonable amount of time, and we might not ever be able to change the climate so that we get less fire. That's just not going to happen. But we can change the fuel to a place where fire is acceptable, that that it is not causing the damage that we're seeing. So it's still fuel management, vegetation management is still a large part of the solution, even though I don't think it was driving these changes.
So we have one thing driving the problem, another thing making the problem worse. And so the question that would be most useful to ask is, what's going to make things better?
Yeah, well, mostly reducing the intensity of fires and reducing that in and around the places that we care about, which largely we've been looking at homes and other buildings and communities, as those are definitely things that we care about, but also looking at forests themselves and the habitat that they produce and our drinking water that comes from forests. Is we actually have to do fuel management to protect those places as well as the houses, or there's no point. Most people, I did actually in the early 90s, I did a little bit of consulting here in Missoula for a homeowner who had a few acres of land, and he had done some work around his house and his property, and he wanted to make sure he felt comfortable that his home was protected from fire. He wanted to make sure that his forest was, because if a fire came through and burned his forest but not his house, he would have considered that a complete failure. That the reason that he lived where he did was because of the beautiful forest. Now, the nice thing is that once you take care of one problem, you've taken care of the other, usually. The mitigating fire behavior, fire intensity, is what prevents, especially here, like the dry forest, from burning severely, and it also reduces the exposure of your house.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Which is there's this whole other issue when you think about our home, the quality of the vegetation around our home and the vegetation that we look at are two things that we would also think influence our home value. Right. If I live in the middle of a beautiful forest, I've got my 100 feet of separation, but it's beautiful around me. Or I'm staring out over a beautiful area. My home has view value, which any realtor would say, hey, this contributes to the value of your home. So if my home doesn't burn up, but the trees around it burn up, or the trees across the view burn up, I've suffered a loss in the value of my home to some. I'm not sure how we quantify about that. I'm sure that's a realtor thing.
Yeah.
That's one, I think, of the less measured economic impacts of wildfire.
Yeah, for sure. And that's something that, ironically, we used to think about that in probably the late 90s and early 2000s. We never did much research on it, but there was a lot of thought about, how do we protect home values and everything burning around it? And then they never went anywhere. And now all of a sudden everything's burning up, and we still don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
But the solution is the same, is that, so fuel management at and near the things that we care about, but also right in lockstep, or actually maybe before, is to build to be more resistant to fire. And that just actually absolutely has to happen.
And what does it consist of? That's like building code issues, building materials?
Well, it's building materials, where you build a little bit, how you build mostly, and then how you maintain the home ignition zone around your house. The thing about building codes, I don't think that's going to do it. There's too many places that are resistant to requiring it from the government. What's probably going to do it is we need a cultural shift to where obviously you need to build this certain way. Why wouldn't you? And then the insurance basically is going to probably help and say, look, we just can't insure a home that is not built to the absolute highest standard.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're up in Missoula, obviously the home of the big fire research center. And yet you're saying that the most important thing we could do would be the cultural shift. So in all of that lab space, where's the cultural shift lab?
It's not here, and it might not be anywhere.
Yeah, right.
So the way I think about it is that our fire problem is one of culture, not of strategy, and not of technology. And that makes it really hard. And I mean, as simple as my wife, who grew up in Helena, Montana, can remember as a kid going out on weekends for the drive in the woods with her family, and was always, check the air in the tires, check the oil, throw a shovel in the back, and a collapsible bucket. It was the era, of Smokey Bear, and people were generally aware of trying to not start fires. And that was in an era when there weren't fires. In the 70s and 80s, it was, compared to now, there was nothing. And for whatever reason, that has left our culture. And I don't think we pay as much attention as individuals to our ability to accidentally start a fire. And like dragging a chain, the car fire was a chain dragging on off a vehicle, and the ranch fire in California, 2018 or 19, I think, the river or the ranch was, a landowner driving a metal reinforced concrete stake into the ground with a sledgehammer that caused a spark that started a multi-100,000 acre fire. Hot shoes on a train start fires. Grinding on bridge construction starts fires. Campfires that hold over. You name it. And I think that we, even as the climate is changing, to make these things more likely, there's more of the year when this can happen. I don't think we're paying as much attention to avoiding ignitions as we could. It's not sexy.
Yeah, right. Another thing that's unpopular but possibly necessary, and that we kind of back our way into, is the prescribed fire. Right. So, yeah, prescribed fire is a pretty popular means for fuel reduction.
Yeah.
When they get away and have destructive consequences, it erodes the public's confidence in the fire service's ability to safely conduct prescribed burns, with the result being that you got a lot of pushback against prescribed fire, especially because of, it's inconvenient, it's smoky, and it's potentially really dangerous and deadly. So it looks like the way that we are backing into prescribed fire is by doing them at a time when there's already a fire, and then just selectively mitigating the fire, selective suppression. Right? So a fire starts, and we say, oh, wow, what a great opportunity for a prescribed burn at the last minute after it already started.
Yeah.
Right. And so we decide, okay, we're going to let large areas of this fire burn because these fuels needed to burn. And then no one can say that we, elected to start a prescribed fire without community approval. right? And then we'll just go ahead and protect the necessary resources, but we'll let the prescribed fire go.
Yeah.
Right. So what do you see going on with that? Is that accurate, what I'm describing?
Well, that's a pressure, that's a forcing on how large fires are managed in some places, for sure. I think that the idea of having a unplanned ignition, allowing it to do good if you can do that safely, makes perfect sense. But there's something else going on in the last few years as well, is that we are generally less successful at containing large fires than we have been. And they're just getting bigger in part despite our best efforts to, even if we were trying hard. The Dixie Fire is a good example. We tried really hard and nothing worked. They weren't trying to make that fire larger. It just got larger despite them trying to prevent that from happening. And now the workforce is down, struggling to keep the number of firefighters up. We have more aerial resources than ever, but there's only so much that you can do with that. So I just think that there are a lot of forcings, including the one that you mentioned, on why fires are getting larger and maybe appear to be allowed to be getting larger.
Okay. Or in some cases are.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, wisely.
Yeah. There's good reason for it, but it's risky.
Okay. So let's go back to the Dixie Fire then. A big fire that keeps getting bigger, and what seems to be very little we can do about it. In the face of a diminishing labor supply, because the way we fight fires right now is very labor intensive. So where do the solutions lie? And I'm not saying they exist currently, but given our basic belief that we could solve most problems if we put sufficient manpower and brain power into it, what are the most fruitful areas for research in gaining the capacity to suppress large-scale fires?
I mean, honestly, it probably gets back to the culture and not strategy or technology. I mean, and getting better at protecting homes and communities with whatever suppression technologies might come around. That's great. But then we have to be careful about how we use it. And because if we use it to eradicate all fire, then it's no good. And honestly, what happens is when fire suppression does not eliminate fire evenly, it selectively eliminates the beneficial fires that if you can contain it, it was probably going to do some good. When the fires are doing bad things, they're totally uncontainable. A recent paper out from some folks here in Missoula talk about that, kind of the censoring of fire intensity is what suppression does. It keeps fire smaller, but it keeps the benign parts smaller. The less benign parts we can't do as much about.
But that's voluntary, right? Like, we're choosing to suppress the areas that were benign when we could have let them burn. And we could focus all of our resources on suppressing fire around our built environment, around our assets.
We could, yeah. And I think mostly the things that we can do around assets, and even actually assets and resources, watersheds and forest stands and timber. Most of the things that we can do to protect them have to be done before the fire starts.
I see.
And that's another, there's however n number of fire paradoxes, and one of them is that before a fire starts, the likelihood is relatively low, and it might seem that we don't need to, or it's not cost effective to do mitigation. And yet after the fire starts, the benefit cost ratio is super high through the roof, but there's no time for it. And okay, so here's the technology that we need is a way to reduce the time that it takes to mitigate fuel and home ignition and whatever to minutes to hours, which is a huge lift. Because it's just not something I think we can do.
Well, that's why I guess they have things like the Wildfire X Prize to try to encourage some super heavy lift out of the box thinking.
Yeah.
For technology.
Yeah.
When I think about the technology myself, I think that in the civilian market, based on the civilian budget for wildland firefighting, it's pretty unlikely that we're going to see a tech come out of that. But when we decide that a problem is a military problem, the budgets increase astronomically, and therefore the type of technologies and resources, move up with it.
Yeah.
So I personally think that our best hope is that we start to categorize wildfire as a military threat, particularly as it directly impacts military bases. When they have to relocate Vandenberg Air Force Base, when the nuclear missile factory in Texas was threatened. That as we see the Pentagon and the Department of Defense start to grapple with wildfire, we could see exponential increases in technological capacity.
I agree. Yeah. And there's a lot that can and will, I think, trickle down to firefighting applications from the military. And probably, some of the most straightforward ones would just be to have constant real-time knowledge of where a fire is by its heat signature. We're clearly moving toward that now, especially in California. But that'll certainly help. Yeah, with fire operations. But I think, most of what the last 10 years of my career in business have been is about, they call it pre-fire. I don't like to call it pre-fire because that implies that the fire event is the focus, but it's basically assessing the hazard, the likelihood of fire before one has started, and then the intensity of that fire, if it does occur. And the thing, like you mentioned, Texas and that event there, and we just actually finished doing an assessment. We're still actually wrapping it up for the state of Texas, and where that series of fires occurred was the highest likelihood place within the state of Texas for fires to occur, and as high as I think it was in the 2 to 4% per year range over a 10 or 20 year period. Over a 20-year period, it's like, you're like 75% chance of experiencing a fire there during that time. And I have seen that our very simple, fairly old school way of assessing risk and of fire probability, it works really reasonably well. So it picked up that. Lahaina was an enormous surprise to most people. Well, for a project that Pyrologix worked on with the Forest Service and Headwaters Economics, it's called Wildfire Risk Communities, wildfirerisk.org. Lahaina was ranked in the 92nd percentile nationwide for wildfire risk, nationwide.
So why was it a surprise?
So honestly, we finished that project in 2019, 2020, and we saw how high Hawaii was ranked as a state. The homes within Hawaii were ranked about, I think, 4th or 5th in the nation, really high up there. And we were surprised then. We were skeptical. We triple checked everything that we had done with that modeling. And we said, there's nothing wrong here. The handwriting is on the wall, apparently, that all the conditions exist for high home loss. It didn't predict what happened there by any stretch. It simply told us that was not impossible. And that was from old school modeling that we've been doing for over a decade. And then there's, we did modeling for the state of California that says the Dixie Fire, which was the largest, it wasn't a single fire, mostly one fire, but 3 origins in the end. Unprecedented, but for our modeling with this tool called FSIM that was produced by Mark Finney here at the Fire Lab, that was a 100-year event. Which, like in floods, it's like, okay, that's a flood. We get it. That's a flood. Well, that was what that was for the state of California. It's like, it finally happened. We got our 100-year event. 2020 was an enormous fire season in California, 4 million acres. And from our modeling with FSIM, that was a 50-year event, 2% chance of happening every year. It's on the tail, but it's not unexpected. It shouldn't be unexpected.
So, and just because you have a 100-year event, that doesn't mean it can't happen again the next year.
Exactly.
Right.
It won't happen the next year in the same place. And so I know in California what might be happening, although we'll see. Like I said,
within 10 years, though,
it could.
Right, like in paradise.
Yes, that's right. I used to think that with as much fire that California has seen, Northern California especially, in the last 10 years, that the likelihood of those big events continuing is much diminished. And that is still, I think, largely true. But when you get beyond about 10 years, it's not the same fuel bed that used to be there in forest. It's something almost worse in some ways, that the grasses and shrubs and small trees that can still exhibit super high spread rates.
Yeah, right. I would imagine faster than old growth forests.
Yeah. Faster. Their old growth forests are slow until they're super fast, and those other fuel complexes are just always fast.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we need a new technology. It'll more likely than not come out of the military. It'll hopefully filter quickly across as a technology transfer to civilian firefighting. And in the meantime, what? Cultural change, that could take even longer, right?
It will take longer, but we got to get started on it. Okay. Basically, we got to get started on everything. The real answer to our way out of this fire problem is that there's no one way out of it. It's all of the above. We got to start all of them right now. Pardon me?
That's good news, right? Because when there's only one way to do something, there's a lot of pressure on that. If there's several holes in the sieve, the water leaks out faster.
Yeah. But a lot of it really, it's going to start at home. That it's not about what the government can do for this. There's actually, managing federal land and even state-owned, government-owned land is unlikely to solve this problem. In terms of risk to homes, it turns out, though, that yes, in terms of forests and watersheds, so protecting surface drinking water and things like that, that's what the wildland, managing fuel in the wildland is really all about. Okay. But for homes, it's mostly what we see from the modeling context is it matters what the conditions are like at your home, your how it's built, the first 5 feet, the next couple 100 feet, and then out from there. So you start at the home and move out, or you start at the surface drinking watershed and you move out, or you start at the wildlife habitat and you move out. That's a place that we have to go.
Which is good, right? Because we have a lot more control over what happens around our own home than we do about culture change and what the government's going to do, right?
That's right. Yeah. And it really falls to us as individuals. Yeah.
Well, it both falls to us and it's fortunately within our control.
That's right.
So the good and the good of it.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. All right. What are the areas of research, that you're involved with or that you're aware of going on right now that you think hold the most promise in the future?
Well, one of the things that we're doing, and it's really to help communities and individuals realize the need for them to take action, is we're applying slightly different old school modeling, but still it's not ML, it's not AI. We do a lot of that, the ML at Vibrant Planet. But we're doing ember modeling, and we're doing what I call fireshed modeling around communities, so the homes around communities. And what we look at is not just where embers produce, but where are the embers produced that actually land on buildings. And so we do the field weather topography fire modeling, and we base that off of high quality gridded historical weather. So it's sensitive to what the weather is like. In fact, I'm going to give a talk in Boise in a couple of weeks using Boulder as an example, the area around Boulder, as an example of how this plays out. And what you see there is apparently there's a fire carrying wind out of the west, because our data, we look at all wind directions and all wind speeds, and we integrate them in a reasonable way. And what we're seeing is it's the west side of most of these buildings that are where the embers are originating that land on the buildings.
Yep.
So yeah, it's all straightforward. It's easy to know, and we can do that modeling anywhere in the country, and make that available like through a tool like Landtender to communities. And then the other type of modeling we're doing, the fireshed modeling, is where can fire be? So either start or get to on a previous day. Where can fire be and get to houses within a certain period of time? And that could be 1 hour or it could be one burning period. There's no point in doing a whole fire season because that's everything. Fire can get to almost everywhere within a fire season to buildings. And so we call that the community transmission zone, CTZ. Sometimes it was, it's transmitted exposure. And then we do a certain thing with that and look at where fuel management can reduce spread rate. And we're going to look at Chris Moran here, he coined this term the other day called pyrosity. Hopefully that'll stick. It's what the parts of the landscape through which bad things eventually happen down fire. And so, and then those are it's like a minimum travel time. It's like fire pass, but it's fire pass to bad things. So ideally you would say, well, we want to do something about the places where the fire goes through and does bad things. And then if you look at how fuel treatment can change spread rate in those areas, which we can do. So we have current fuelscapes and we have 9 different ways we can treat the fuels. We can see how much those would reduce the spread rate. And we can identify these places near communities and homes that should be optimal for reducing the exposure of those houses.
Okay. So when I think about the physics of that, let's say on the fire's moving linearly from point 1 to point 10. Point 1 is where the fire is right now. Point 10 is my house. The ember cast from point 6 are the ones that are going to land in my gutter and light my house on fire. The fire's still back at point 1. So would it make sense then to use aerial support to bomb, that spot 6 in advance of the fire rather than fight the fire back where it is with a, maybe a low possibility that you're going to stop the fire front where it is, but get out and pre-retard the area where the embers are going to be generated that affects the nearest community?
That's an interesting strategy. That is, well, I always say there's not outside the box. There's no box. But yes, that's quite possible that would be an effective strategy that we are unlikely to ever try because we've never done it or considered it before. Really, it's a fairly non-standard thing, and but it would be interesting to try it or to try it in simulation world, and see if simulations within their assumptions would bear out that could be an effective strategy.
Okay. The tech that we're working on right now is, using jet engines as giant spray machines, basically for spraying either suppressants or retardants. Yeah. So, you can easily atomize, more than 1,000 gallons a minute of retardant or suppressant and spray, pretty large coverage areas, 20 plus acres per minute. Yeah. So that's maybe where we could actually do an in vivo test of that, using that tech and, a simulation in advance of that. Yeah. But I would think that taking technology like that and applying it to the fire, you may or may not work, but but if it advances, right, that fire is going to hit spot 6, and then the ember cast is heading for the neighborhood. So, why not? Hit the neighborhood and then head back to the area where the ember cast is going to originate. Yeah. But, I watched the Marshall fire that you're referring to. I can see it from my window here. I can see actually all 3 Superior, Marshall, Louisville. I could watch them all burn. It was pretty spectacular and terrifying.
I bet.
More spectacular, actually. Yeah. But I wondered, looking at it spread, and I drove down to watch it, the biggest source of ember cast that would affect your house is your neighbor's house. Yeah. Right. Because that was both ember cast, radiant heat, everything, right? Yeah. It all coming off of there. So the houses were too close together. And now if you drive past there, you'll see them putting back the houses exactly where they were. Yep. Probably using the exact same materials they were originally built out of. Yeah. And that's what that's the saddest part, right? Is like the lesson seems to be long from learned.
It is long from learned. And that's the part of the culture that I was saying we really have to change to where, I have a house now here in Missoula that's fairly well protected. I kind of want to build another house in a place that is more exposed to fire, just to show that you can do it and without losing very much. And there's just a lot of things that we have to do very, very differently. And I'm just thinking I need to talk to an architect about why all this stuff is, but we build houses mostly over crawl spaces or basements. And that puts them a couple of feet above grade, the main floor, which means that for outdoor space, you often build a deck. And those are often made out of wood in the past. Well, there's this thing I've heard of, and it's for a different reason, the zero entry home, where there are no steps to get up into the house from the garage into the house for increased mobility. But the other thing about a zero entry home is that you would never be tempted to build a deck. You actually couldn't. There's no space for it underneath it.
It would be a slab. If anything.
You build a patio. Exactly. Yeah. It's a slab. It's a patio. And those are very easy to build that don't burn. That's their whole point. And it's like it's going to happen. Building slab on grade instead of over crawl spaces and basements. Or if you do build it over a crawl space or a basement, that we just don't build decks anymore. We just don't do it. And we don't build with combustible siding anymore. We don't do it. We've already gotten rid of the wood shake roofs, more or less. We don't have to talk about that. Why did that go away? Turns out the reason was hail. that the hail damage to wood shake roofs was through the roof.
So to speak.
That was no pun intended, but that was bad. And it actually, looking at insured losses in Colorado, before some of their bigger fire seasons starting around 2006, I think, Missionary Ridge, I forget what that was, but before that event, that event in one of those years for the entire state was like ranked 10th. All the fire damage in that one year ranked 10th compared to 9 other single-day events in the state of Colorado for insured damage. I did this talk in 2006 at the Fire Lab, and I asked everybody there, what was perils 1 through 9? And it was hail. Now, I haven't looked back to see what's on that list now. I'm sure fire is at least 1 through 6, and then hail. But other things have been really. Hail used to be really damaging. That's what got rid of wood shake roofs, to our benefit in fire.
So could hail be beneficial in mitigating fire in terms of a good hailstorm knocking all the leaves off the trees that would allow for canopy spread?
Well, no, except that it would then put all the leaves off of canopy spread onto your roof and into your gutters. If we were good about getting all that stuff off of our roofs and gutters, then yes. Okay.
Is there any scenario in which the benefit of gutters outweighs the risk? Is there any reason that we can't just mitigate the impact of water falling on the ground by putting gravel on the ground instead of creating these ember catchers?
Yes,
on the roof?
I think that I totally agree that this hypothetical house that I want to build would not have gutters. And we would simply find another way to mitigate water coming off the roof. That way works, and it's, okay, we keep water away from the foundation. It's like, okay, that maybe was a problem at some point, and that was the solution. Let's find a different way.
Yeah, and the foundations is not as big a threat. It's not as big a threat as fire now.
Yeah, and then, because you look at all the different ways that houses catch on fire, and embers are like number one, and all the different ember things that embers can, the substrates. A hemp doormat has been implicated. Birds nesting, in the concavity of a tile roof. We just have to culturally accept that we can't allow any of that stuff to happen anymore.
Wood mulch.
Well, wood mulch, don't do wood mulch near your house. So right. Rock mulch. We know all these things. We just have to accept that most of us have to do them. And that's so one of the things that we do all that modeling for the fire shed and the ember modeling. And then we also kind of classify the landscape into like which homes are directly exposed to fire, meaning that they're essentially in the woods, indirectly exposed, like quite a lot of the Marshall Fire. Those were home-to-home spread and embers igniting because they were just yards. And then non-exposed or limited exposure, which is generally about what we do it is about 1,500 meters from a contiguous block of burnable fuel.
Okay.
And so that we first did that for that Wildfire Risk Communities project, and we're still doing that now. It turns out, I forget the numbers now, I think probably 2/3 at least of homes are in those first two. They're exposed to fire. 2/3 of the non-exposed part of the landscape is almost zero in terms of the acreage. It's really, really small, but it's obviously super densely populated. So it's tons and tons of people do live in places that are not directly exposed. Like the center of Boulder, Colorado is not directly exposed, but the edges certainly are.
Manhattan,
exactly.
Density, all concrete.
That's right. Yeah, but the edges of it, of these things are certainly, and so yeah, it turns out I think that more of us are exposed to fire than we think. And here's an interesting phenomenon or result anyway of all of our modeling. We have all this. We know where all the buildings are through these two different data sets. We've taken the census data and spread it out to where the buildings are, so we have a pretty good idea of where population is and where housing units are concentrated. And we know where fire is, and so with all that probability modeling. And a very, very small number of structures are extremely exposed to fire with really high probabilities. And now I wish I could just draw on the screen for you, but to say that mostly that the largest amount of home loss by our modeling is not expected to come from the highest probability places. It's expected to come from the middle, because that's got the combination of fire and people. And we've done the math. This is not just, assuming that our assessment is correct, the math shows this. And it's that this is what's scary, is that it's individual homes there are not more likely to burn than the high risk ones. But there's so many of them at this moderate risk, huge numbers. And it includes Lahaina, and it includes Louisville and Superior, Colorado. It includes all these places. It's like, why would we have to worry about fire? Well, 10 years ago, nobody would have told you had to, honestly.
Wake up.
Yeah, but things are not quite the same anymore.
Yeah. So it was interesting. You were talking about the western exposure, right? Because we do have a lot of, eastbound winds coming out of the west.
Yeah.
So my house is right up against a mountain, and there's nothing to the west of me except mountain.
Yeah.
And all the homes are to the east of me. So I figured I've minimized at least my ember cast from other homes risk. And I hope wildfire doesn't come creeping over the mountain.
Yeah. No, so yeah, you've got you are responsible. It's good.
Well, but my insurance company said they would drop me if I didn't cut the tree down that was, near my deck.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I know.
Yeah.
Oh, right. I'll confess now that in the mid 90s, I built a house on 40 acres in the woods outside of Missoula, Montana, that had wood siding and wood decks all the way around it. And yeah, I built that then, even though I was getting started in this business, and I would absolutely 100% not do it today.
So having done it, what could you do about it? Would you apply a retardant to the wood surfaces and move fuel sources away from it as your main two options, or is there another option?
Reside the house. So it had a metal roof and it didn't have gutters. Okay, that's good. you can reside the house, or even just reside, the lowest few feet of the house. And then, but it had a lawn all the way around it. You can do that, but just embers onto getting into the siding, and on the deck. It's just, you can do everything else, and you should do everything else that you can do. Keep your wood pile away, be vigilant about keeping nothing under the deck. You can do all that stuff, and that will help, right? Most of risk mitigation it's not a binary thing. It's not like you were susceptible and now you're not. You change the odds. That's it.
I see.
The worst house in the world can still survive a fire, and one of the best can still be lost, but the probabilities, those are the exceptions, not the rule.
Well, you talk about a binary world, which makes us think computers, but I look behind you. What you got there?
Can you see my big stack of computers there?
Yeah.
It's not quite, it's about a 25-year history of computers that I've used over the years.
Those are computers, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, they look like files from here.
Oh, at the top. Okay, I'm sorry. I wasn't sure what you were seeing.
Looking at all your paper files there.
So that's the other holdover. When I was working at UC Berkeley for the grad students and for Bob Martin, I was responsible for cataloging all of his paper files. And so when I came to Missoula in 1991 and started my career, I just started my own paper files and kept track of them in EndNote, and this is all how you do it. And I don't know what year the last one went in there was, but it was about 10 years ago.
But this all exists digitally somewhere, I hope.
It does. Well, yeah, almost everything that I do have a printout of or something does exist digitally. Yeah.
All right. Last question for you.
Yeah.
Because of all that paper I see behind you, when computers first came out and they said, "Oh, this is going to be the beginning of the paperless office," right? And of course, what it allows us to do is just print out paper faster and faster.
Yeah.
And whether it's paper that we're printing from our computers or rolls of paper towels, the idea was like, oh, don't print that, save a tree, right? I'm thinking that maybe should be debunked now too, because the problem isn't that we need to save trees, it's that we need to consume more trees in the right places. And you only do that by creating demand for paper products.
Yeah, I think there's truth to that. I think because in general, yes, to do more fuel management in forests, especially in the West, we have to have something to do with the wood. And the wood...
Especially non-dimensional lumber.
Exactly, right?
Right.
Exactly. And pulp is the highest and best use of the trees that we should be removing from the woods. And I can tell you here in Missoula, we just heard 2 weeks ago, 2 more local mills are closing. The paper mill closed about a decade ago. The small diameter mills, a couple of other ones closed before that. And our ability to do restoration work in the woods is threatened by a lack of something to do with the wood. And 2 things to do. 1, make paper. 2, make energy. And those are both problems that we could address. We can resolve, but not without a subsidy that's something like how all of our other energy is subsidized.
So it shouldn't be the idea that when we go to the store, like, oh, I'm looking for the recycled paper goods, like, that's just a way to avoid consuming more pulp, which needs to be consumed.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
We do need to.
That's big cultural changes out of this show today. Then.
Yeah.
Right. Stop buying recycled paper goods because we need to have a market for the pulp.
Yep.
And the idea that we shouldn't be consuming the pulp is in fact pulp fiction.
There you go.
All right. Great. Joe, if folks want to get in touch with you and learn more about the research you're doing, what's the best way to find you?
Pyrologix.com. Hit contact. It'll come right to me.
Wait, it couldn't be easier than that.
Yeah.
Great. Joe, what a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to join me, and I hope we'll do this again sometime.
That'd be great. Thanks, Steve.
All right, great. Thanks so much. Great conversation with Joe Scott, founder of Pyrologix, now merged with Allison Wolf's Vibrant Planet. You have been enjoying, hopefully, a scintillating hour of conversation right here on The Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. We're sponsored by Team Wildfire, and we'll see you at the next one. Take care.